All right, so this was the question, and then underlying this question is, what method are you going to use to study it? A lot of you came up with very important characteristics of social formation, but how are we going to study it 70,000 years ago? And this just gives you a timeline of some of the major civilizations. We tend to focus more on the Greeks and the Europeans as opposed to other indigenous and other civilizations globally. The Europeans wiped out, for the most part, a good portion of the civilizations that existed in the Americas. Well, one way to start studying it is to look at our closest relatives. And so this is the tree. That first bottom oval is where orangutans broke off. And then the next one is where the gorilla. And then in the hominin group, there's two, the pan and the homo. And the pan up at the top there are bonobos and chimpanzees. And then the very top is Homo sapiens or Homo sapiens sapiens. And it's indicating that there is a higher level of consciousness. Well, if we're going to look at the human social formation, we can look at how our closest relative, the bonobos, is how their social formations were organized. And there's a big difference between the chimpanzees and the bonobos. The chimpanzees' reproduction is based on a dominant male, like a lot of nature, and it's aggression for access for reproduction. Bonobos, on the other hand, are organized around in a maternal brood. The females in the bonobo group are in charge. And people say, well, one male bonobo is stronger than a female bonobo, which is true for the most part, but not stronger than 2 or 3. And so if a male forces his way or tries to force his way on a female, the other females will drive him out of the community and even kill him. And they also control the males from eating the young, which is important. So 2 very different social formations. And so here, this gives us a little picture of Homo sapiens. And my thinking is that it would have been impossible for humans to survive if they did not have the social organization that was based on the maternal brood like the bonobos. Because once they leave the protection of the jungle forest and are out on the plains, they're a lot more vulnerable to lions and tigers and bears, oh my. And so if there was fighting over access, if males were fighting over access to females, the social structure would be torn apart, and humanity, we would not be sitting here if they had that. And so early human social formations were matrilineal, the same as the bonobos. So you can see that all of the kinship relations are based on the mother. So the ego is the female in the middle, and the red dots are the mothers. And then the others are blank are the the fathers. And there gets to be very complex kinship systems. But a guy, Lewis Morgan, in 1877, wrote a book called Ancient Society. And what he did was he went to live amongst the Iroquois up in the northeast of the United States. And he was amazed to see that their kinship was matrilineal, like many native groups are. And he then became curious about, where did this matrilineal kinship system start? So he went and talked to all of the army people who were invading and had contact with ancient people. He talked to anthropologists, and then he did a linguistic analysis. He studied 170 languages, and every single one of them, the language was set up reflecting matrilineal kinship, so that those relationships are captured in the language. 170. Overwhelming evidence that these early human social formations were based on matrilineal kinship. And then Frederick Engels wrote a book, The Origins of Private Property, the Family, and the State, which takes, and he wrote this in after Morgan's book, but he takes Morgan's findings and then expands them to a broader analysis. And during the witch hunt in particular, because Engels was a communist, the academic world poo-hooed all of the, poo-hooed means, downplayed, argued against all of these findings. And they did so because that goes against the patriarchal system that we have now, and it was communist. So top anthropologists, Claude Levi-Strauss, Franz Boas, they started writing articles criticizing this whole theory. And the foundation of their criticism was that there's no evidence. However, there is evidence, but that was totally discounted. And it wasn't until the rise of the women's movement that Evelyn Reed wrote a book, Women's Evolution, where she looks at Morgan's work and then all of the different studies that have been done and showed how these anthropologists were really doing a big disservice to the science, because women anthropologists began investigating and finding the truth. And she was actually, I knew Evelyn. She was a member of the same political organization, the Socialist Workers' Party, that I was a member of for 20 years or so, and still believe the concepts and the ideas, and we'll talk about them some point. And her companion, George Novak, wrote a book that we'll read from for next week and the next 2 weeks, actually. And so with this kinship system, then understanding that, we can look at other factors that led to the qualitative transformation to human languaging. And this qualitative transformation is what Vygotsky focuses in on. How did human beings gain human consciousness? And it's at this time of the qualitative transformation that this takes place. And with art, there's a level of abstraction and symbolic representation. And then with the tools and hunting for bigger gain, getting more protein for the size of the brain, the neurons, and then the development of the vocal box. And then, so if we're going to look at these two different approaches, we can look at process, and that process is languaging. And we can look at the product, which is language. And those two things should not be conflated. They are interrelated, but distinct. And so this is a point that Vygotsky underscores. But what happens is that people look at language, linguistics, but don't understand the process. And this process takes place on two levels, the individual and the species. So we're looking at how the species gained languaging. And I believe that all life has language. They communicate. These one-cell bacteria communicate with other bacteria cells by releasing a chemical molecule. That chemical molecule can only be taken over by the same species, and they have another molecule that other species of bacteria. They then communicate, and they make a social decision. When you get a virulent bacteria cell inside you, the body doesn't just immediately go and attack because it would overwhelm the bacteria. The bacteria reproduces and reproduces and reproduces. And when the community, the bacteria culture, colony, feels that they have the strength to overwhelm the organism, then they attack. They are communicating. They have their own language. And that's why it's important for us to always distinguish between animal and human. And so that's a fundamental part of life, is this communicating. And then this is, again, another big piece of Vygotsky's work, is the concept of making sense. And when we talk about making sense, excuse me, we tend to conflate making sense and making meaning. That makes sense. But it's important to look at the difference between the two. Sense comes from sensing. This one cell is getting information in patterns, energy patterns, from the environment, chemical, electrical, and thermal. And based on that information, it is deciding to go forward if there's food, or to flee if it's hostile. And so that process of taking information in, sensing it, then perceiving it, transducing it, it's changed into the language of the cell, processed, and then messages are sent to those little flagella to make the thing go forward or back. So right at the very beginning, activity is a huge piece of life. This process of taking information in, sensing it, transducing it into the language of the organism, and then acting, judging and acting on it, is thinking. This is a thinking process that is specific to this particular species. That process, though, sets the foundation for our ability today. 25% of the synapses that are in the human brain, those synapses are ends of neuron cells. 25% of the proteins in those synapses responsible for taking information in and processing it are found in the one-celled bacteria, your eukaryotic cell. So right from the beginning, the brain processes and the thinking processes are unified in the first forms of life. And then it's a question of following the evolution, the development of the brain. The whole thing is taking in as much information as you can, processing it, and then acting on it. And a big part of that processing is, does this feel good or does this feel bad? Is this positive? Is this energy coming in? Is it positive? Is it going to sustain life? Or is it negative? It's going to bring about death. That's affect. And I don't use the word emotion for non-human animals. I think emotion is a human construct, and we'll talk about this later. But all life has affect as a fundamental part of its existence. And so this is a point Vygotsky makes throughout, the key role of affect in the development of life and of relationships. So in a certain sense, we can say that this cell, I sometimes refer to this cell as one-eyed Carrie out of eukaryotic, got the big eye there. This one cell is aware of its environment. It's aware enough of its environment to know whether to leave or to go forward or just to hang. That awareness is the foundation for consciousness. There's a big difference, though, when we use awareness. We tend to think about it as far as human awareness. But with humans, it's conscious awareness. You all are aware that you are aware. And that's a big jump in the development of human consciousness. Other animals are not aware that they are aware. And so that's an important piece of the whole development of life and their thinking structure. Now, when we talk about meaning, if we go back and we imagine, 300,000 years ago, 150,000 years ago, early humans interacting with the environment. And with rocks, if you hit a certain rock certain way, they break according to the laws of the universe. And that break causes a sharp edge. That sharp edge is really a wonderful tool for getting more meat off the bone or fighting, protecting, digging. So they're going through this process here. And then there's a word that it could maybe be a sound that's related to two rocks cracking together. And that sound is part of the whole affective experience that these two individuals are going through and repeated over tens of thousands of years. And this is a process that takes place in all of the different tribes. Human groups, early groups, usually are around 60 to 100 people. And they then, with other tribes, because they were based on similar matrilineal systems, those tribes did fight on occasion, but more often than not, they integrated because they needed men over in this group and they needed females in this group. And so over this period of time, this sound becomes part of this whole experience. And then this sound internally, an individual can hear the sound in their own, they'd actually say it out loud, which would then stimulate them to go and find a rock. So the rock then took on, that sound took on meaning. And this is a big jump, and this is a key place. This is the very essence, foundation, core for Vygotsky's whole system. This meaning that's being created between two individuals is the key to the development of human consciousness. And he looks at it at two levels. One level is for the species, and the other level is for the individual. And so he also differentiates between external, there's the sound, which is external, and internal. And internally, what happens is that sound, that meaning becomes the foundation for the whole development of a meaning system, a conceptual neuronal network. Every word is a concept. Rock. And a key piece, thinking piece, is, and this is again key to Vygotsky, is the concept of generalization. And it's sort of a funny term. We use it, but we really don't necessarily understand what it means. And it's important to get a good understanding of this concept. There's the rock, the specific, but that sound does not just refer to this particular rock, it refers to all rocks. And that abstract thinking process of generalizing is key to the development of the concepts about the world around us. And that goes into building a big conceptual system and with meaning at its core. But Vygotsky's talking about internal meaning. Each one of you has your own system, thinking, languaging system. And it has meaning at its core. That internal and the external intersect. That's how we can communicate. But they're distinct. And what's happened in almost all the literature about Vygotsky, all of the interpretations that you read, is they conflate those two pieces together. And the key person in conflating it was this person I mentioned last week, Leontiev. He broke with Vygotsky because he did not either understand or agree with this concept of meaning as being central. And that concept ran afoul of the Stalin bureaucracy. And so Leontiev, instead of taking Vygotsky's concept and understanding it, rejected it, and then took on the Stalin Soviet bureaucracy's interpretation and developed a whole another theory that he called activity theory. It's a fundamental break right at this point with the essence of Vygotsky's work. And almost all of the English translations and other translation are through the perspective, the distorted perspective of Leontiev. And that's been one of my big challenges, is trying to discover the real meaning of Vygotsky's work. And I talked about these two planes of languaging. I came across this quote and it has to do with word and words, and I'll read it. As if the soul's fullness didn't sometimes overflow into the emptiest of metaphors, for no one ever can give the exact measure of his or her needs, his apprehensions, or his sorrows. And human speech is like a cracked cauldron on which we bang out tunes that make bears dance, when we want to move the stars to pity. I just thought that that was beautiful, but it comes to the fact that we all have our own meanings, and we can never fully express that with other people, which is one of the complications of relationships. So the Homo sapiens left Africa around 100,000 years ago, and this shows the various times at which they migrated up 12,000 years ago to South America. And a key piece of this qualitative transformation was the domestication of animals and crops. And it gives you a little feel for the distribution. And you can see that it starts with the dog about 12,000 years ago. And the reason that what happened with dogs is if a dog got rejected by its pack or was wounded or something, it could come close to human groups and get food out of the scraps and that. And then because they had fire, there was a certain amount of protection for the animal as well. And for humans, this provided the first home security system, where the dogs would bark when they heard a predator and humans couldn't get the smell, or so they would start barking, which would alert the social group. And so there was this symbiotic relationship between dogs and humans. And then the big turn was with the bigger crops. And then, so farming, organized farming developed, and these were in river beds around 10,000 BCE, before the Common Era, where the Tigris and the Euphrates come together, that has been the site of massive, massive armament dropped on the people and destroying the civilizations. And then 7,000 BCE, China, 6,000 BCE, and the Indus River, and then around 4,000 in the Americas. And this shows these spots around the river. And a key piece of understanding where we are today is understanding how we went through this transition from the patriarchy to the matriarchy. What happened was, with the domestication of crops and irrigation, you needed more labor power to pick the crops and tend the crops. The same with larger herds of domesticated livestock. And so the Greeks, instead of killing their enemies, enslaved them, brought them back to work in the fields and also in the households. And it was a hierarchy was set up. So before, in the matrilineal, where we had, why don't you go ahead and shut that? Thank you. In the matrilineal, the hierarchy was organized by this group of older women, but here it became the people who had the wealth. They then began organizing society, and you can see they broke them down. Only men, not women, could be citizens. And right there you see this transition based on private ownership of wealth. And so the slaves were actually part of their household. The word for family, the etymology, actually comes from a word slave. And so they were seen as part of the household. They were not allowed to go out of the house very often. Why not? Because the patriarch wanted to make sure that the firstborn son had his blood and not somebody else's. And in order to any social formation, you've got to start with the economic foundation. How are means of life being produced? The very top are the owners. They have the legislator that makes the laws, the court that arbitrates, and usually one individual, the executive branch. And they have education. They've got the religion, the oracle at Delphi, and then culture. And in order to maintain the order, this hierarchy, you have the army and the police. And all of this is set up in the form of the state. The state doesn't exist as like the state with a boundary. It's a concept of how society is organized. And this shows this hierarchy, and this hierarchy exists today. This is what's called democracy. When people couldn't vote, women were excluded, and the people who ran the whole thing were the billionaires. And this is a foundational piece of social cultural theory, but often left out of the equation. That to understand any society, you need to understand how it is organized, because you look at education in there. In whose interest is education designed and set up? In the interest of the people, the billionaires. So that's a structure that came. And then we look at the Aegean civilizations. Because of all the islands around Greece or the Aegean Sea, they were very good shipbuilders. And so they had all kinds of trade routes. And then the Middle East and Africa, there you can see, also contributed. And so this then led to development of different kingdoms and states in Greece, Macedonia being a prominent one. And Alexander the Great, who was a Macedonian king, then went on this 10-year campaign, taking and pretty much colonizing to a degree that whole area in Greece. What they were taking to was Greek scientific understanding. And then they were also getting other ways of knowing the world from Africa, from the Middle East, from other indigenous people. And then that really sets us up for where we're going to start next week. Because within the Aegean Sea, you had all of these. You first of all had a slave-based society, which created a lot of free time for the wealthy to sit around and talk and think and do science. And then the questions started coming up. What is the origin of the universe? How do we study it? What is the origin of life? And the Greeks were philosophers and scientists back in that time. And so our reading assignment next time is from the origins of materialism. And it's the evolution of a scientific view of the world, the marriage of science and philosophy. And so that's the foundation. So right there, you have one Mons view of the big picture. And so I'll end it here, and we will chat again. Thank you.